Andy Mock, very welcome to the mother of all talk shows. Thanks for joining us at this hour. I'm most grateful. Thank you. Now, I know that technology is your forte, but I also know that you take a close interest in the issue of currency. I've been arguing that the main weapon in the armoury of U.S. hegemony is actually the dollar rather than the cruise missile, rather than the military hardware, which they're not actually all that good at anyway. They don't like to hear this, but they haven't won a war since 1945, and it wasn't even them that won that. So how have they remained the global hegemon all this time? The answer surely lies in Bretton Woods, and it lies in the Saudi oil deal with them, which led to Saudi Arabia pricing its oil in dollars. If it begins to change that paradigm, U.S. power potentially falls away like leaves in the autumn.
Yes. No, George, you're right. I mean, everything we see from so-called American soft power out of Hollywood perpetuates this myth that, what makes the U.S. great is its military machine. And there's no doubt that it's enormous. Something like $750 billion U.S. dollars a year is spent on defense. That's the U.S. military budget. And there's a lot of impressive technology. It's a large army, of course, but you're absolutely correct. The real power and the real foundation of American hegemony is the U.S. dollar. And to put this in, relatively straightforward terms, and of course we can get into some of the economics of it, but put it this way. Money used to be worth something. So you think about gold. People would use gold for money, and that's because it was hard to find. It was valuable. And what happened, think about it this way. If you or I, instead of having to give something valuable like gold for things that we wanted, we could go to the pub, to the bar, have a beer, and instead of giving real money, we could write a piece of paper that says, I owe you some money. If I wanted to go buy a car, I could do the same thing. If I wanted to buy a house, I could do the same thing. Now, wouldn't that be a wonderful world? And in fact, that is what the U.S. has been doing since the 70s, when they delinked the U.S. dollar from gold, meaning it used to be that a U.S. dollar stood for a certain amount of gold that you could exchange for gold, for something of real worth. And today, or actually since the 70s, it's become what's called fiat money, which means that it's nothing more than just a piece of paper. But now you've got a problem. If I wrote an IOU and I went to the bartender would probably laugh at me. But what happens? The U.S. was able to say to also at the same time to Saudi Arabia, because everyone in the world needs oil, and Saudi Arabia then and still is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, oil producers in the world, say, look, Saudi Arabia, we would sure like it if you would only take our IOUs for oil. And of course, oil is a very real and valuable product that everyone around the world needs. So in exchange for providing a military guarantee, Saudi Arabia said yes. And of course, now that creates an enormous demand for these IOUs. So if you or I were able to do that, we would have a pretty good thing going there. And in fact, that is what has been happening. Now, the problem with this, though, is that once you get addicted to doing something like this, you tend to write more and more IOUs for more and more stuff. And that's one way we could understand inflation, which, of course, is skyrocketing today, not just because of the unfortunate events in Ukraine and the food and energy crises that it's causing, but just in general. It's very hard for anybody to restrain their desire for things, but it's even harder where you have to try to persuade people to support you in a two-party system. And the best way to do that is just promise to give them more stuff. And so you then have more and more of these IOUs. So, George, you're absolutely correct. That is, I think that this is really the root and the foundation of American power, American hegemony. And we're in a very interesting time now in that because of the unfortunate events in Ukraine, the U.S. has launched not only a military war and a propaganda war, but also an economic war against Russia. And the economic war is the one that I think is more important and doesn't get nearly as much attention. So I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to talk about this today. But in this economic war, what the U.S. has done is it's seized Russian assets, including the assets of the central bank. Now, here's the big problem with these U.S. IOUs then, is the U.S. at the same time is saying, well, you can also use these IOUs because you can trust us that we will be fair-minded, essentially referees of the financial system. And, you know, the U.S., we know that follow the geopolitical scene can be very, very difficult to deal with at the country level because every 4 years there's a presidential election and there can be a 180-degree pivot in direction. So, you know, if you're a country, you're a Germany, you're, you know, another country, a UK even, and the U.S. says one thing, and then 4 years later says, well, sorry, we've changed our mind. We want to go in another direction. You know, that can be very, very challenging. But now I think what the world has seen is not only does it have to deal with this, but the financial system, the U.S. dollar, which most of the world relies on, has been shown to be fundamentally unreliable because now I could say if I was issuing all these IOUs, oh, you know what, because I don't like you, your IOUs are now worthless. So this is, I think, really going to create a problem in the long term for the U.S. I hope I didn't go on too long about that, but
No, you didn't. It was a positively brilliant answer. And what I was just thinking, if American imperialism is a paper tiger, we didn't know it was an IOU paper tiger. I think the metaphor is brilliant. But they've run out of road on it because China is increasingly capable of not only eating its lunch, but actually taking over the IOU business. It is increasingly capable of being a reserve currency itself, isn't it?
Well, we really have to see, George. I mean, clearly, and again, if we go back just to the basics, why would anyone want U.S. dollars or Chinese yuan? And at the end of the day, we really don't care about these pieces of paper. And in fact, today, they're really not pieces of paper. They're just bits in the digital world. And, you know, we transfer a number from one account to another account. But anyway, it's useful to think about it as these pieces of paper. So why do we even want these pieces of paper? It's because we can exchange them for stuff we actually want. It could be a cup of coffee. It could be a nice dinner. It could be, you know, a vacation. And ultimately what it comes down to is who's producing the stuff that people want. So we've known for decades that China is known as the workshop of the world, but increasingly China's making not just low-end things or, you know, relatively low value-add things like shoes, clothing, toys, but increasingly moving up to, say, 5G equipment, you know, the world's most advanced smartphones. Companies like Huawei are doing this. So what you need, though, is that the people in China don't want dollars because people in China spend yuan. So at the end of the day, whoever's making the most valuable stuff, sooner or later, their currency becomes the most sought after. Now, again, but if you have commandeered the choke points of the global financial system, so not just enforcing the use of the dollar for things like oil, but you also control the electronic network that allows banks and through banks, everyone else around the world to move money around the world. Now you've got something. So even if you're not producing as many things as other people want, and there may be a country that's producing more of them, this is, again, the stranglehold and I think the foundation of American hegemony. And you're right that we're seeing this challenge today, and it's not just by China. So I should say that, as you know, and I'm sure many people in the audience know, that India has recently came out and said, we're going to work with Russia and set up a rupee-ruble payment system that avoids the dollar, using the dollar and going through SWIFT. So SWIFT is the interbank network that, even though it's headquartered in Brussels, is actually really controlled by the U.S. So we're seeing some cracks here, and I think that there's been enormous resentment around the world at dollar hegemony, and sometimes, what feels to many people like the capricious use and abuse of the system, but this might be the final element that really undermines the system. Not to say the dollar will go away. Again, the U.S. Is the largest economy in the world in nominal terms, but it's actually only the second largest in purchasing power parity terms. So it's not that the dollar is going away, but I think that the U.S.'s ability to enforce and punish countries, companies, people around the world may be severely weakened. And as I wrote in a recent piece that the U.S.'s launching of these 3 wars against Russia was intended to solve a problem, but it might have created an even worse problem for itself. And, as then President Obama allegedly said about Joe Biden, never underestimate Joe's ability to F things up, that here, the intended cure for a problem might be far worse than what they're trying to solve.
Or, as a famous Chinaman put it, sometimes they struggle to lift a huge stone only to drop it on their own feet. Andy Mock, you are a star. We'll have you back on the show if you will.